Welcome to this first presentation to Ask a Conservator Day. Good morning, everyone. My name is Laurent Crevelier, and I am the book and paper conservator here at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives. I work in the preservation department where I provide specialized input to help with practices and decision-making, and I perform preventive and interventive treatments to make sure our collections can safely and durably fulfill the mission of the institution. I hold master's degree in conservation, specialized in paper from University of the Arts London, Camberwell College. And I interned at the Royal Collections at Windsor Castle, the British Museum, and the Special Collections of University College London, where I was also working before I moved here. I am also a bookbinder. So today I would like to talk to you about how conservation is essential to providing access to collections. After explaining why sometimes we need to withhold objects, I'll be using examples and images from our work with Hoover to illustrate how we intervene, preparing materials for digitization and imaging, exhibitions and loans, repair library materials, collaborate with the media, and treat items made unavailable because of mold. So sometimes conservators are referred as the bad guys who won't let you have access to certain items. But when I see the marker mentioned on the back of this parchment, I wonder who the bad guys really are. But if we do not share, there are good reasons. And sometimes it's for the researcher's own good. Some collections may contain hazardous substances that are poisonous or carcinogenic or even radioactive. And who would think, for example, that this innocent-looking little dress made with flour sacks from the Herbert Hoover subject collection has an arsenic green belt, or that these Russian plant samples from the ARA, or American Relief Administration collections, were possibly treated with heavy metals formerly used as insecticides. For a reminder, the ARA was started by Hoover and provided food and medicine to millions of people affected by war and revolution in Europe and Russia in the 1910s and 20s. And they collected a considerable amount of information, including this sort of samples. But most generally, it is because the material just can't stand any further handling and is at risk. Some objects are too fragile because of physical, chemical, or biological damage. Like in the case of this flaking photo on the left from the recently accessioned Sidney Drell collection, a distinguished physicist and fellow of the Hoover who died in 2016, or in the very common case of brittle paper found in the archives, for example, of Friedrich von Hayek, a Nobel Prize winner, philosopher, and classical liberal economist, whose life spanned the 20th century. So it has nothing to do, as you can see, with age. On the contrary, older materials often behave better in time. And for some, we have solutions and resources now. And for others, we have to protect them until we do. Slide. So yes, we dread letting patrons freely access certain things, like this little banknote that looks more like a cat's hairball. Slide. That is, until we do what we do best. Slide. Because you see, the mission of a conservator within that of the institution where we work is to manage change in objects, to make them stable and allow them to tell the best and fullest story they can, and for the longest time. It's only normal then that the ways in which we provide access follow the different activities of the library and archives. So let's have a look, if you will, through a few recent examples we worked on. Slide. So the first highest traffic in the conservation lab comes from digitization activities. Within the Digital First initiative, we are reviewing and prepping Hayek's archives for digitization and future serving in the reading room, which means that we make sure that they are properly conditioned and we repair the objects that are not legible or cannot be imaged or handled without risk. To do so, we introduce new treatment protocols to quickly return functionality to the documents. And the images you can see here are taken before and after treatment of, on the left, onion skin documents, and on the right, a document with what we consider to be a damaging repair that was removed and replaced. Slide. Sometimes that means we also need to perform miracles. In the case of the Kung papers, for example, we were able to allow access to documents that were deemed impossible to image otherwise. Kung was a Chinese official and diplomat active during the first half of the 20th century. His papers were so badly affected by mold, they had the consistency of puff pastry. If you can imagine, several layers, very flaky, stuck together. Just like this 7-page accordion that we successfully unfolded and lined with Japanese tissue. Slide. We also prepare documents for the digital side of exhibitions, materials for the current ARA exhibition in the Hoover Tower, food and medicine, here at Stanford, for example, that needed flattening and mending. Slide. And in extremely rare cases, some pictorial reintegration. And if you can see the difference, it's the game of the one difference between the left and the right. There was a missing piece in the corner of this poster, and the infill was achieved with a digitally generated print that was later adhered to the back of the poster. And that is because the damage in that area is particularly distracting for the global reading of the whole poster. Slide. From the reading room, we receive researchers' requests to prepare materials to image, either because the existing images are not good enough or because there aren't any yet. It's a rare opportunity to assess, clean, and consolidate materials, knowing that our brand is attached to the quality of the final image, especially if they are published. You can see here the difference after our intervention on the images of an album gifted to Anna Mitchell, who was an American Red Cross worker who helped Russian refugees in Istanbul in the 1920s. In the case of this album, I also removed metallic particles from the paper called shives that would have become brown stains in the future. So for example, top left, you can see just what cleaning does before and after, and underneath you can see the holes of the binding that were damaged by heavy usage. So the book is now functional again. Slide. We also collaborate with the exhibitions department to make sure our ambassador objects are stable and look their best despite their age, which we don't hide. Slide. So for example, the food plus medicine or food and medicine exhibition that is currently in the tower, for example, the material is already over 100 years old and is often fragile, dirty, and damaged. And the damage is often a distraction to the eye, as I said. So here we have details of 3 artworks, possibly made in schools as thank you tokens for the ARA officials. And you'll see the whole objects in the next slide. Right. So our work consisted in cleaning and repairing the objects in a way their condition would not distract from their narrative. And you'll successively see how they changed before and after treatment, beginning with the one on the left, if you want to focus, for example, on the top left corner, or the overall cleanliness of the object. So that's before, and if we slide to the next. For the center one, the most fragile, you can focus on the right edge and slide. Yes. And for the one on the right, it is an overall result. It's kind of difficult to see it in small, small images like that. Slide, please. Yeah. So sometimes you don't need to hope for a big difference in before and after. But what is nice is that we have these objects here and they are useful for others. Slide. So this poster, for example, is featured right now in an ARA exhibit at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum in West Branch, Iowa, curated by our research fellow, Bertrand Patnaud. And more than half of the objects featured in that exhibition are actually copies from our own collections. Slide. And close proximity to the physicality of these objects also gives us access to forensic inputs that we can share with subject specialists, curators, and researchers. And in this case, we discovered, for example, that the 3 artworks you've just seen belong to a series of at least 5. They have letters in the corner on the left, you can see them. And we are now looking for the others. For now, we can tell they were exposed to light for a long period, and there's photographic evidence of that. And by the number of pinholes in the corners, we can tell that they have been moved locations up to at least 8 times. Also, a rare find in paper items. You usually find that more in easel paintings. One of the artworks show what we call a pentimento, which is an artist's change of hearts, if you wish, at the top, where a rather Soviet-looking title was replaced with one that included the American flag on the right slide. We also prepare objects for loans. It includes vetting the premises where they will be displayed, accurately assess their condition, courier and install the objects, but also make sure they are in proper condition to be handled, to travel, and to withstand being displayed, again, representing us. That is the case of 2 family Bibles translated and profusely illustrated by hand by Salvation Army Captain Masuo Kitaji, in part while he was detained in several World War II camps. They are currently on display at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. And the first one you see here on the right had a ripped cover, poorly repaired with tape that prevented proper opening and damaged the photograph of the author. Slide. And the second Bible fell victim of its popularity, if we can say, because it's beautifully illustrated in the first pages. The first 6 pages are all torn at the gutter. And the repair done with small individual sutures in between text line was challenging because all the inks and colors that you can see are very sensitive either to moisture and to solvents. So the repairs had to be done in between the lines. In our 2 o'clock presentation today, for which you can use the same link, we will show in detail the conservation treatment of these Bibles, as well as the rest of the operations of the preservation department that were undertaken behind the scenes to prepare the loan of these 2 Bibles. Slide. Library materials, we are talking about book and pamphlets and periodicals. They are often more challenging than flat items because of the 3rd dimension and the fact that we need to retain mechanical functionality. Slide. There's a small pipeline in our lab of damaged books that we repair or set in conservation bindings made of card to quickly stabilize them so they don't wait to be rebound and they can be put back into circulation very quickly. Slide. Mostly when damaged books are paged for imaging, display, or the reading room, we make sure their condition does not stand in the way of access. Like in the case of these 2 books about famine in Russia that were requested for the preparation of the exhibition I talked about earlier. Here we removed the old acidic Hoover Library binding and replaced it with more suitable materials and techniques. Slide. And here, for example, we chose to return the book to its original paperback form. And for that, we used a pulp to repair the spine, to reconstitute the spine, actually, using pulped historic paper, and a binding technique that we developed here to prevent further damage in paperbacks. Slide. And now, because all we do is about sharing stories, on top of welcoming researchers in our lab to handle for them objects that require special care, slide, we also support the outreach and communications team by prepping and handling collections for TV and film crews. Here you can see us providing support to a BBC crew filming a documentary, a CNN team interviewing Xiao Tinglin our research fellow, and the preparation and filming of a piece by Estonian TV about rare Estonian diplomatic archives. Slide. And finally, I would like to talk to you briefly about Mold Mondays, an initiative we just implemented. And the image that looks here like fireworks is actually a mold colony on a poster seen under ultraviolet light. Slide. We are now releasing items that had been removed from circulation due to mold infestation. Like, for example, on the left, this magazine with Margaret Thatcher, where you can see the before and after mold removal in the central part. So these objects are being progressively triaged, treated, and safely made accessible with a warning note on the left, because health and safety is a concern. And their condition is also registered so that together with curatorial importance, priorities can be established. And you can see here my colleague Brittany and I celebrating the release of the first box of the otherwise doomed by mold documents in last April. The previously mold infested items are stored in a specific area on regular mold watch for eternity, because yes, our time frame is slightly longer than most people's. Slide. So thank you very much for letting me share our passion with you. I'll be happy to take questions. This is your opportunity to ask a conservator. Do not miss later on this afternoon at 2 o'clock our presentation on the behind the scenes preservation adventures of the Kitaji Bibles. And I will now take questions if you wish. And I can see here that we already have a few. So first one here, how are deteriorated photographs restored? Okay, so this has two aspects. One, which is the word restored. Restoration and conservation are two different aspects of what we do. Restoration is about bringing an object back to its original aspect, whereas conservation is about stabilizing an object so that it can withstand time and be available and handleable for the future. An object that has been conserved may not look the part, despite the fact that it is stable, whereas the restored object just looks good. So for photographs specifically, it will depend on many, many factors. The first one is the nature of the process. So it can be a positive, a negative, it can be on paper, it can be on glass, it can be on porcelain, it can be on whatever. It can be a silver process, it can be a carbon process, it can be so many different things. It could be on metal. So we have to have a good knowledge first of what exactly the original object is. And from then, we move on to the conditions. So there are different things that can happen to photographs. They do deteriorate whatever we do because they have ongoing chemical processes, but also they suffer from several sorts of accidents. So they can be deteriorated by handling because they have creases on their emulsions because they have been folded. They must have been damaged by water, by mud. So there is no real answer in a generic case for all that. Sometimes they're stuck together. So every single case will be a different case. And we will apply a protocol for each one of these cases. So there's no generic answer for how we can improve deteriorated photographs. What I would say, though, is that one of our big principles is less is more. So minimal intervention is always better than to introduce things on pictures for the future. So I would say that if you want to restore a picture, it's better to conserve it first, have it as clean as possible, make a good digital image from that picture, and then digitally restore the picture and do all the Photoshop you want over it. So that was a very interesting question. Thank you. I have here another question, which is about loaning documents to museums of their original country, and what access we can provide to those documents. So this is not exactly conservation question, that is more for the curatorial side of things. We have lent in the past Belgian documents to Belgium, etc. I think the best advice I can give this person is to go to our website and contact our curators teams, and they will answer in a better way. Wow, lots of questions, more here. What is the weirdest thing I've worked on? Oh dear. That is a very, I love every single aspect. When you're working on something, you spend so much time in contact with that object that you end up entering a sort of symbiotic state with it, and the object starts to talk. I can tell you that the oldest object I worked on is a 4th century fragment of a Bible in Greek that was about the size of a post stamp. I've worked on Indian ink rubbings that were very challenging, extremely moldy. You could not sneeze near them. So yeah, everything is very interesting. Everything is weird, and everything is interesting. What do I have here? Are there things that I can do at home to treat objects already affected by mold, or should I go? Okay. So if you have moldy items, first of all, you have to protect yourself because mold can have detrimental impact on your health. So you do not want to breathe more mold than what you're already breathing in normal air. So if you don't have, of course, a fume cabinet or a fume hood that can vacuum all what you do, the best is to go outside. And first of all, make sure that is dry mold, because if it's active mold, then you need to dry the object first. When it's dry, you go outside and you use a brush, like for example, a brand new makeup brush, a blush brush, and you dust off all the mold from the objects. There's not much more that can be done at home. The best thing to do against mold is good housekeeping and keep the objects in a dry and cool environment. Dryness is important. So for example, no relative humidity higher than 60% with a 68 degrees temperature, because higher than that, you will have mold growth. If you have something that is very moldy, and if the paper is already damaged, then you should definitely go and see an expert. What kind of intervention do I most enjoy doing? It's very interesting. I do like to do Japanese lining. It is a technique where you laminate a document, or the verso of a document, with a very large sheet of Japanese tissue. And there is a whole symbolic choreography around making your paste, diluting your paste, putting the paste on the paper, and then holding it in the air. So if you can imagine, it's just as fragile as wet toilet paper, but you have this gigantic sheet holding on a stick, and it looks like a gigantic curtain, and it's very, very graphic and very delicate, and practice makes perfect. You have to do a lot until you have this beauty of the gesture to make your lining in one go, and so that is the kind of treatment that I do enjoy doing, and also because it's generally preceded by washing, and washing documents is always very dramatic because people think like, oh my God, I didn't know you could actually immerse a document in water and wash it. What is one thing that as a conservator you wish more curators and collectors knew? Oh, that is very interesting. Well, I would like people to be more aware of the materiality of the objects and the things that we can get from there. So there's a whole study that goes way beyond the simple contents of what's on the documents. For example, when I was working at University College, I was involved in a DNA swabbing project, where by just swabbing DNA samples from the surface of books, you would get a considerable amount of information. And within that project, one of the big results that was shown was about a Bible that had a consistent biome of diseases all through all pages, with mainly gut and lung diseases that people would just deposit on the pages, and even the Black Death. And then there was this one gathering in the middle that had a completely different biome that showed cholera, and they managed to link that cholera strain to an epidemic in Venice in the 1500s. And so why that bit in the middle was different from the rest. And so it turns out that because the binding was obviously an Italian binding, we were able to find out that this Bible that was originally made in Germany from the DNA of the skins traveled to Italy, where it was rebound. And on that occasion, this one gathering was replaced. And it turns out that it was the gathering that concerned the chapters on how Mary Magdalene is perceived. And so the take on the Mary Magdalene story shifted, and then the Bible continued its way over. So there is much more to the physicality of objects than just the contents. And so I wish that curators and collectors knew about that. So over cleaning is not necessarily good. Restoring to a nice object is not necessarily good. And there are some mistakes that some collectors may do because they want things to look good. Like, for example, adding waxes to skin bindings to make them deeper in color, or maybe more supple for a couple of days, but it is detrimental for the object on the long run. So it is in the interest of everybody that conservation spreads a little bit more knowledge about materials. We have here, what is the strangest item? So I have answered that question already. I have a question about the gloves as well. Like, whenever there are images of conservators handling objects without gloves, there's the same questions. So it is true that in the past, and for to look more professional, I guess, than needed, conservators have had a tendency to use gloves, especially if they're being filmed. Gloves are not necessarily mandatory, especially because cotton gloves leave residues. Even if they are considered lint-free, they will leave residues on the objects, and we don't want to add extra material to the objects that we have. You lose dexterity when you're wearing gloves, and for some objects, it's actually less desirable to wear gloves. For example, when you're handling thin paper or books, you only wear gloves if you need to protect the object specifically, and that is for objects that are made of metal and photographic material, because your oils and amino acids on your fingertips will leave finger marks that can absolutely not be removed from photographic material and that go deep in several layers of metal if you touch metal. And by metal, it's a large sense, and that includes, for example, gilded surfaces. So those are mainly the things while you will use gloves, which is to protect the objects. Also, because gloves can catch in certain protruding parts of objects, so you don't want to have gloves in all circumstances. The other side of using gloves is if you want to protect yourself, either because you have sensitivity to mold, for example, or if there is a question about heavy metals that can be contained in previous insecticides, in certain pigments, a lot of lead and mercury that you don't want to be overexposed to, and or other poisons that are out there. There are many in many collection items that look very unsuspicious, like the little dress with the arsenic green belt, or there are some very deep purple colors from Victorian times that are called mauvine dyed. They are also carcinogenic. There's radium in some watch hands and numbers that glow in the dark. So for those cases, you may want to use gloves. But other than that, it's quite safe to use to not wear any gloves, provided you have very clean hands. And I may take one last question, maybe. Why Japanese tissue? Okay. Well, Japanese tissue, there are several sorts of Japanese tissue. We always say Japanese tissue, but it's kozo fiber because there's Mitsumata, Gampi, there's different Japanese tissues for different usages. The great advantage of kozo fiber Japanese tissue is that it is very long fibered and very resistant for a very light weight. To give you an example, the copy paper that you use is about 80 to 90 grams per square meter. And in conservation for repairs, we can use paper that is about 6 grams per square meter, and it's just as resistant to traction. So it makes for very solid and very stable repair with something that is almost undetectable. So that's why we use Japanese tissues. Another question, thank you very much. How do you become a conservator? Oh, well, there are different ways around the world, but mainly you have to sit for a course that is at least a master's degree course, which is the international standard that several heritage international bodies have defined as being a conservator. You have to sit for a course. So there are different ways, but generally in America, for example, you have to have not only already some experience with internships with conservator settings, also a chemistry background, and then go to the process of an undergraduate and a graduate course in conservation. In the UK, for example, where I was, you can have a different background and then just sit for a full-time master's degree only. But in the rest of Europe, you have to have a 4 to 5 year undergraduate and graduate program, which are all extremely selective because you really need to demonstrate that you have the passion and the will and the motivation and the vocation for heritage. So yeah, there is actually a Wikipedia webpage with the list of all the conservation courses that can be accessed. I hope I answered that question. Can you tell us more about Ask a Conservator Day? Sure. So why November 4th, or at least around this time? It is to commemorate, so it starts with a commemoration of the floods of the Arno River in 1966 in Florence, that destroyed a considerable amount of heritage in museums, churches, palaces, and libraries. And it kind of shook the world a little bit, the way the fire at Notre Dame shook the world as well. And it motivated a group of what we call the Florence Angels to congregate in Florence and start helping and treating all the heritage. So there was a lot done with statues and sculptures and etc. But there was also a huge amount done in book and paper conservation. And it is, for us, book and paper conservators, a little bit the point zero of the developing of the career and competence in book and paper conservators, because a lot of advancements in the knowledge of materials, in the knowledge of book structures, and in the knowledge of how to treat them, how to triage them, and how to stage the treatment in several moments. Like, there's the emergency right now, and then there's the time after to treat things. So how can we store things? Do we freeze things? Do we let them wet? Do we dry them? And then how do we conserve them? How do we box them? There was, for example, a kind of box that we call a phase box that was developed at that time. So the floods of the Arno in 1966, that was 56 years ago. It's easy for me to remember because that's my age. And then, so that is the why which we chose that date. And then it gained momentum, and the why we communicate is also because it is always in the interest of the institutions and the public to know more about what conservation is about, the difference between conservation and restoration, and how it conserving heritage in general connects us to the past, helps us to build on the experience of the past, benefit from the beauty and the contents of all the stories that can be shared. So a big part of being a conservator is also being a pedagogue and a communicator, and that's why this Ask a Conservator is a particularly good initiative for us to share things. Thank you all very much for being with us. If you have more questions, don't forget that we have Twitter takeover at Hoover Archives, and you can ask us all your questions concerning anything conservation related, as long as you use the hashtag Ask a Conservator. It's one word only, hashtag Ask a Conservator at Hoover Archives. Again, thank you very much for being with us today. I hope to see you at 2 o'clock. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second presentation of Ask a Conservator Day here at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives. For those who were not with us this morning, my name is Laurent Crevelier. I am the Book and Paper Conservator here at the Hoover Institution, and I work in the Preservation Department, where I provide specialized input to help with practices and decision-making, and I perform preventive and interventive treatments to make sure our collections can safely and durably fulfill the missions of the institution. I hold master's degree in conservation, specializing in paper from University of the Arts London Camberwell College, and I interned at the Royal Collections at Windsor Castle, the British Museum, and the Special Collections of University College London, where I was also working before I moved here. I am also a bookbinder. What we refer as the Kitaji Bibles are two family Bibles translated from English to microscopic Japanese and profusely illustrated by hand by Salvation Army Captain Masuo Kitaji, in part while he was detained in several World War II camps in America. If you Google Kitaji Bibles, you will find a plethora of well-illustrated articles and videos about these over 3,000 page each volumes and their incredible adventure that involve being lost, found in a dumpster, put for auction, reacquired by the Kitaji family, and eventually deposited at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives. That would justify a presentation on its own, and that's not the point of my presentation, which is more about preservation and conservation. In our case, for its exhibition, Sutra and Bible, Faith and the Japanese American World War II Incarceration, the Los Angeles-based Japanese American National Museum requested the 2 Bibles on loan from our institution. And this presentation is about what happened in the background and led to their current display at the museum. Side note, we do not have an active loans program, but we do occasionally lend objects to other institutions. And in this case, the loan was considered particularly pertinent within our Japanese diaspora initiative by Kaoru Ueda, who is our research fellow and curator for the Japanese diaspora collection. Slide. And so from the request began a long process involving countless emails back and forth between our curator, our exhibitions teams, the curators of the exhibition at the museum, and the preservation department. Generally, this type of loan takes approximately 2 years to set up from the date of the exhibition counting backwards. And from the moment an object is requested, the preservation department becomes involved, vetting the venue, assessing the condition of the objects to guarantee that they can withstand being moved and displayed, and providing input for the loan agreement. If necessary, conservation is also performed prior to conditioning the objects for transport and display, couriering them, installing them, monitoring, deinstalling, couriering them back, assessing their state and condition, and reshelving them. So let's have a look at some of these operations in detail, if you wish. Slide. So in a preliminary state, as part and condition for the loan agreement, a survey of the environmental and safety conditions of the receiving venue is performed, on top of analyzing the responses to a very long questionnaire filled by the Japanese American National Museum, vetting the venue, including assessing the layout, security of the premises, the physical display modalities, as well as light levels, temperature, and relative humidity conditions. Slide. Simultaneously, the condition of the Bibles themselves was assessed using a thorough and comprehensive reporting tool that we created. Excuse me. The Bibles were also imaged and in recorded settings to allow for comparisons of the images before and after the loan. And on this occasion, we noted that existing damage to the Bibles could lead to further damage if stabilization and consolidation work were not performed. The damage would also prevent the Bibles from being displayed in a functional and aesthetically pleasing way that would allow for their correct reading and interpretation. So a treatment proposal was submitted to the preservation and exhibition teams, as well as to our curator, Kaoru Ueda, and decision was made that both Bibles would undergo interventive treatment in the conservation lab. Slide. In parallel, work began in the conservation lab as well to create custom boxes to house both Bibles. And you can see here quite complex, what they call clamshell boxes with a little mobile tray underneath to be able to lift the Bibles out of their boxes without handling them directly because they are fairly heavy. Slide. And also with the knowledge of which pages of the Bibles the curators wanted to display in their exhibition, 4 different acrylic cradles were produced to accommodate the respective configurations of the open books. And the reason why we needed to make more than just one cradle is that the museum and we decided that it would be better to display several pages and to create a rotation of the pages to limit the number of hours each page would be exposed to the light to avoid fading, because the Bibles would be exposed for quite a while. Slide. So regarding the condition of the Bibles themselves, most often well-intended or well-intentioned repairs cause more harm than good. And in the case of the Bibles, sticky tape, or what we call pressure-sensitive tape, had been used to mend damage that had occurred before the objects came to us. In the case of the companion Bible, which is the one with the brown cover, the aging adhesive became cross-linked. That's a technical term to say that it was sort of crystallized and yellowed, if you wish. It also straddled pages, which caused tears. And because of the location on top of fragile media that would bleed or stain the paper in the presence of either water or solvents, the tape carrier, like the little plastic support of the tape, and the adhesive layer were removed mechanically, but the yellow discoloration, unfortunately, was left on the paper untreated to reduce the risk of messing the drawings and the writings, if you wish. Slide. In the case of the new analytical indexed Bible, which is the black one, a more recent repair was also done and poorly aligned, and it was causing tensions to the left made leaf. The made leaf is the leaf that results from pasting the decorative paper, the decorative end paper on one side, and the first leaf from the block of pages from the text. And the adhesive was removed using a heated spatula and organic solvents in this case, because it was not threatening any of the text. Slide. In the same Bible, on the left side, and when we say left side, it's because in conservation, you tend not to say the front cover and the back cover, because, for example, in certain languages like Japanese or Chinese or even Islamic bindings, the front and the back cover are not the same as in Western books. The front and the covers are. So you refer to the left and the right side from the point of view of whoever is reading the book. So in this case, on the left side, so foredge facing the reader, the two end leaves, the made leaf and the first adjacent fly leaf, were intentionally adhered together along the foredge, and both had been torn off and would be completely detached if it were not for the previously mentioned piece of adhesive tape. But the tension caused a silver gelatin photograph representing Kitaji himself that was originally pasted on the made leaf and also partially detached to get in the way of closing the book properly, which over time introduced a creased fold on the image itself and cracks on the emulsion layer. So the leaves were repaired and reattached in their original alignment, and the photograph was pasted back into position for safety. And you can see here to the left and to the right, the before and after pictures of this intervention. Slide. The companion Bible, the brown one, had become victim of its popularity, if we can say, because it is the first 6 or 7 pages are the most highly illustrated. So tendentially, people would handle the Bible and show essentially those first pages. The problem is that the tightly bound short fiber machine-made paper of the end papers and fly leaves could not hold up to the frequent opening of the volume by its users and to constantly access the remarkable drawings of the first pages. So over time, this handling caused folds and at the head of the volume near the gutter, which cracked and became torn on several pages, and each action of opening each page occasioned further extension of the tear going down and down. So really we had to intervene before the Bibles left our institution. Slide. So repairs were done using, it's called Zing Shofu paste. It's a wheat starch paste that is particularly refined in the sense that most of the gluten is taken out. And that paste is cooked and diluted with deionized water. And we used also 2 weights of unbleached kozo Japanese tissue, which is a long fiber, very light, and highly resistant paper for the repairs. And in hardly accessible areas covered in text and drawings, because the drawings go really, really down to the gutter and the margins, and with fugitive inks and media, we used minute bundles of single parallel kozo fibers to stitch the tears in between the lines and the drawings using magnifications because it's so intricate. And it was kind of a wink also to Masuo Kitaji himself, because he reportedly used a magnifier to write his translations of the Bible into what is referred as microscopic Japanese on the pages. And you can see on the images here, the one in the middle on the top over my nail is one of the stitches, which is just a few fibers of kozo that are impregnated with paste and then carefully placed in between the lines of text in several locations. And I have marked in the central images at the bottom all the places on that page where the stitches were placed. And on the verso, they were placed in areas that would not correspond exactly with the ones from the recto, so that it would make a sort of a network of fibers to keep the pages together. Slide. And a corollary of conservation work is gaining access to parts of objects that would otherwise be inaccessible. And in the case of the new Analytical Index Bible, we now know that there is no text between the made leaf and the first flyleaf on the left side. They were pasted together, so we couldn't really open. And you can see on the first top left image, you could hardly put a spatula in between the pages. But once they were detached and released from that sticky tape, you could actually open and clearly see that there was no content in between those sheets, and that needed to be documented before putting them back on. And also, we could see that the drawing of Mount Fuji on the outer part of the right made leaf was printed because originally it looked like a drawing, but we could see with magnification, with better access, that it was actually printed on a fragment of paper, the verso of which was also printed. And because it was partially detached, we had access to part of the text, which was also documented, so that we can possibly in the future trace the origin of the drawing. So we hinged back in place the drawing instead of pasting, so that access would be again possible in the future. And we did that because if we didn't, it would be just loose and at risk of folding or catching onto other materials. And when you're a conservator, you also need to know when to stop and the things that you can or cannot do. So this Bible, for example, the black one, will require further treatment in the future because there is a group of what we call blocked pages that are stuck together. And we did not treat that pages because we did not have the time or the means at the moment to analyze which substance is adhering the pages together. So until the substance is identified, we cannot treat those pages, but there is record that this, this conservation project needs to be done in the future. Slide. And finally, to prepare the Bibles for the display out of their cases on cradles, we created compensation blocks to make up for the original volume of the Bibles in their outer cases, because each Bible has an outer case, to help the case retain their structural integrity and also to look better, frankly, in the display cases. And all the condition assessment and all the conservation work carried out on the Bibles was fully documented, so that in the future conservators know exactly what has been done, when, where, on which page, with which material, which kind of solvent, so that they can take it from there if needed. Slide. So with the Bibles now stable for transportation and display, they were placed in their bespoke boxes. They were bagged just in case any water would be unwillingly present during their transportation. They were boxed, they were secured and crated in a way they would not be affected by vibrations or sudden shifts in environmental conditions. And by that, we refer essentially shifts in relative humidity and temperature. And you can see the different layers of protection that the Bibles had in our lab. Slide. The case were then couriered from our facilities to the Japanese American National Museum by road. And they were left in the box for approximately 2 weeks, so that the box and their content would be able to acclimatize inside the box to the conditions, the new conditions in the museum, so that the shift in temperature and relative humidity wouldn't be too sudden for them. Slide. And once at the museum, the Bibles were unpacked, carried to their display cases and installed. And the second image always reminds me of one of the last images of those movies where you have people chasing treasures that go hide a box in a repository. It's the backside of museums. Slide. And to display the Bibles on their acrylic cradles, we used invisible polypropylene straps to secure the volumes open and to limit their movement, either from natural draping, because paper has a tendency to respect gravity, and so they would drape naturally, or also because of seismic activity. Recommendations were given to the staff of the museum on how to flip and secure the pages for the following rotations, which they did by themselves. And the monitoring of the environmental conditions began with little gizmos that you can see in the image on the right. Completely to the right at the back of the case, there is a little display. That little display you will see now in all the museums inside display cases. It is registering and monitoring the temperature and the relative humidity inside the case and sending the information wirelessly to be recorded. So we have, as lending institution, also a record of the conditions in which the objects have been kept while they were in the museum, because just vetting the original conditions is not enough. And we have seen on this occasion that the original conditions when they were assessed during wintertime are quite different from the conditions during summertime. And so the monitoring is also very important in known conditions. And there we go. The Bibles will remain on display at the Japanese American National Museum through January 8th, 2023. And after that, we will repeat the last operations in reverse up to their self-reshelving in our repositories. And that's the story of the backside of the loan of the Kitaji Bibles. Thank you very much for your attention. If you wish to read the story in detail, I invite you to use the link that my colleagues are going to put in the chat. It's a link to my article published on the Hoover Institution website, where the whole story is told in a little bit more detail. And I am happy from this point on to take questions if you wish. This is your opportunity to ask the conservator. And I do have here some questions already. How long does it take to do conservation work on something like these Bibles? Okay. The conservation work, there's two phases on in the conservation process. The first one is diagnostic, to understand better the paper, understand better the media you're working on, and that took actually longer than the conservation itself. So doing the assessment of the condition of the Bibles took about a week. And the conservation work itself must have taken about 2.5 to 3 days of full-time conservation person. I have more questions here. Why Japanese papers? Well, Japanese papers are traditionally used in conservation, and it's actually kind of funny that it's a loop that comes back where a Japanese cultured object is conserved with Japanese tissues. Japanese papers, and especially kozo fiber papers, are long fibered, and they allow for very light papers to be very resistant. So, for example, a copy paper that you would use in a copy machine here is about 80 to 90 grams per square meter, and we can use papers that go from 0.3 to 7 or 12 grams per square meter. And those papers are so light and so resistant that they do allow for strong and resistant mends and repairs with all sorts of adhesives, but mainly wheat starch-based or methylcellulose or hydroxyethyl methylcellulose, but that's a bit too much going into details. The Western conservation learned a lot from traditional Japanese and Chinese conservation techniques in the field of paper. What was the most complicated portions of conservation work when working on the Kitaji Bibles? Well, certainly the stitching of the pages in between the text lines, because the place where the damage was in the gutter was already hard to access. But on top of that, not being able to put in there a strong repair that would guarantee a solid bond between the page and that little stub that was left in the gutter was a bit frustrating. So it was painstaking to place every single little of those stitches, because you have to prepare the stitches first. Because they don't come like that. You have to pulp the paper and then stretch them and then dip them in the right amount of paste to place them under magnification. So that took a long time, and you have to wait in between operations so that they're absolutely dry to go into the next page, and you don't want the repairs of one page to stick to the next page. So that was the hardest in there, and you have to work in such positions that at the end of the day, you have a bit of a pain in the neck. Why is documenting what conversion works matter? Okay, so we need to document what we do because we wish sometimes that conservators of the past had documented what they had done so that we could intervene. But there are two reasons mainly. One is that it helps, the records help conservation work in the future to address removal of previous operations in the best possible way. But also because we are changing the materiality of an object. And we have to be honest and saying, this is the object as it came, and this is what I am adding. So this is not genuine to this object. This is an intervention, and I have to tell you what it was, how it was done, and where it is on the object, so that you know that this was not original for the object. So these are the two reasons mainly why you document what you do. And also, in a broader sense, when you are in an institution, you want to keep the record for all the objects of all the interventions that happen, because sometimes you can pile them up, but at some point you need to go back to the original object and remove everything and start anew. And also because technology changes and we discover all the time that there are new methods to do certain things, and that some methods that we thought were safe are proven not as safe as we originally thought. So we need to go back and remove and do something else again. When would you want to remove a previous repair? Oh, that's very pertinent. That makes sense with what we were saying. Precisely when it becomes detrimental to the object. An old repair can be from the 17th century, it can be from yesterday. If it keeps the object stable and functional and introduces no risk for the object, then we tend to leave it there. If it introduced a risk, or if there is a question about its longevity, then we would have a tendency to remove it and replace it. It is not, in the case of conservation, at all a question of aesthetics. Some old repairs are actually very interesting and are kept in place because they are part of the story and the evolution of an object. It's only when they are problematic for the rest of the object or adjacent areas that we would remove them. But even if we remove them, historic repairs are kept aside and documented so that the knowledge of their existence is kept as well as their materiality. What do I have here? How solid are the repairs? That's very interesting as well. So the repairs need to be just as solid or less as the original material. You tend not to make a repair that is more solid than the material, because if there is any movement, any shift in tensions that can be caused either by a change in temperature or relative humidity, then you don't want the repair, for example, to pull, to stretch, or to be more solid than the original. It is a big part of our work to find repair materials that are the most sympathetic possible with the original material. So as I would say, just not quite as solid as the original material, but solid enough to be stable for handling mostly. Are there situations when you would avoid doing repairs? Yes. If there, I like to quote someone, a TV personality, who said, doubt means don't. If you have any doubts about yourself, about the effect of what material or what adhesive you're going to use is going to have on the objects, then by all means, just remove yourself and do not do it. It is best to have an object that has good signage saying fragile, open carefully, or do not open, than to have a repair that has been done in a conditions where you don't have the knowledge of all the consequences that you could do. And it happened especially with the Kitaji Bibles. We had time to treat a certain part of it for the exhibition. The blocked pages are stuck together with something that is very greasy. And so until we can find the moment, the time, and the equipment to do analysis on what those stains are, we are not going to treat those. So this is definitely a repair that will not be done. I hope this answers the question. What does the family think about the preservation of the Bibles? Were they able to see the Bibles in this repair state? That is a very nice question. It is unfortunately one I don't have the answer to. And I mean, I would be happy if someone had repaired something that was treasured by my family. It's actually one of the reasons why I became a conservator in the first place is what I call to perform miracles and to see the joy and the in the eyes of someone when I bring back something that has miraculously regained functionality or is now an object without a problem anymore. So I would be delighted to have their feedback, and I'm just hoping that they are happy about this. And I'm certainly sure that they are happy about the fact that the Bibles are now accessible and functional for research and for display. Any stories of very difficult or strange repairs? Yes, so I had a very similar question this morning. Someone asked me what was the weirdest repair I did, and I had time to reflect, and I think that I can answer now. It was a piece of what is called visual poetry by an English poet called Simon Coates, and it was an homage to the French painter Seurat, who paints with little dots. And his artwork was a little card of paper that had been pasted with glue, and then he had sprinkled, you know, those little sugar sprinkles that come in all colors. And it was really very nice. And there are 50 of them, 2 of which are at the National Gallery in London, and there are some in the British Museum as well. So it's an important piece of art. And at the institution where I was working, they had 1 copy, and unfortunately in time, all the little sprinkles had fallen. And my work consisted in retrieving all the sprinkles at the bottom of the case and placing them back one by one. And I could find the place where a sprinkle of the same color was placed so that I could put every single sprinkle in there. Unfortunately, many sprinkles were lost, but at least the ones that were at the bottom of the box were conserved. So that was the weirdest thing I did. And it was actually very interesting and nice because I was in contact with the artist himself, and we kind of validated the protocol to make it accessible. I have here a comment more than a question. I think that our curator, Kei Ueda, kept the family informed about the process and in preparing the Bibles for the month. So there you go, you have the answer here. And yes, another one says, yes, the family is very happy with the handling and preservation of their heirloom. That fills me with joy. And then there is more information about the fact that the exhibition seems to be extended up to February 19th. That is good. I will have then to coordinate with our colleagues at the museum to maybe do 1 more page shift. And this information that we have here was given on behalf of the Kitaji Bibles. So thank you very much for this extra information. Do we have more questions? What is the process for returning? Well, if you watch my presentation in reverse, returning will be, so on the last day of the exhibition, the Bibles are closed, put back in their bespoke cases, and then members of the Hoover Institution Library and Archives will go to Los Angeles to bag them, box them, crate them, secure them, put them on the van, courier them to here. Well, they will stay in the crate for a while to re-acclimatize to our temperature and relative humidity conditions until we put them back in our stacks and repositories. That's the returning process. Do we have any more questions? I don't think so. I'm looking here. Oh, yes. What are the drawings made with? That's interesting. So the drawings were made with whatever media was available from World War II up until a little later, I would say, into the 60s and maybe probably a little bit more in the 70s. So you have ballpoint, you have felt point, you have color pencils and color markers and a black ink that I could not identify, but it is very common and commercially sourced writing and drawing material. It's not artists' media. And that's the reason why they're particularly fragile, not only to water or solvents, but also to light. They were not meant when they were created to be light fast. So that's why you cannot expose the Bibles for longer than you should. And also the reason why we keep the record of how many hours of which intensity of light have been applied to each registered page, so that we have the maximum hours of exposition per year in the grand scheme of things. There's a standard in museums, which is what we call a one just noticeable difference per periods of 50 years. So the one just noticeable difference is the moment when you can see that something has faded. When your eye sees the difference, that moment you're allowed one every 50 years in museums. So you have to be very careful and count your hours and measure the light very, very carefully. Will the recording of this presentation be available for later viewing and download? Yes, it will. I am not sure in which conditions, but it is being recorded and it will be probably made available soon. And we will definitely make this available. And I want to also stress that there is a link to the article that I wrote and that is now on the Hoover website that has most of the information that I shared today with you and probably even a little more. And if you have any more questions, or if you don't, take advantage of our Twitter takeover on @Hoover Archives, where we are answering questions about conservation. You just need to go to our page @Hoover Archives and tag Ask a Conservator. It's just one word, Ask a Conservator. And we will be happy to answer your questions about conservation of the Kitaji Bibles or of any other material. And if we are happy and if I see no more questions popping in, I have suddenly, how important is conservation input in the process of loan document and contract drafting? So it is important. It is important in the original document. When you do your loan agreement, you have to put in appendix the condition assessment of the object. So the conservation input is it's like a loan in between people. I'm lending you this. It's in a good state. Please return it in the similar state. So the conservation documentation here is extremely accurate and extremely precise. And to give you an idea, for example, for the companion Bible, which is the brown one, the conservation records go to the detail of describing the zipper of the case and telling what textile is the zipper made, what metal are the teeth of the zipper made, and the little, every single part is described and in the highest possible detail. So that is very important. And if there are any conditions, like there's a scratch here, there's a smudge there, there's things that we know and that we're not going to address because they're part of the history of the document, then they are described as well, so that whenever on the receiving end someone sees, oh, this has a scratch, yes, but it's on the documentation. So it is not a condition for the loan in itself, but it's an integral part of the loan agreement and the document. And it's also useful when we retrieve the Bibles to see and compare what was originally described and see if there is any damage that was added or not. So yes, it's of considerable importance, I would say. And even the conservation is described in the document as well. Thank you. That was a very interesting question. And I think we're gonna stay here for now. I invite you to go to our Twitter page and participate in our several Twitter feeds. Along the day, we have been sharing several stories about the work we do here at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives. There's the story of the Kitaji Bibles, but there are many more. And if you want to ask us questions, you have until 4 o'clock today, Pacific Standard Time. Thank you very much, everyone, for being with us. And I would say, see you next year for Ask a Conservator Day.